The Plein Air Easton Podcast is brought to you by the Avalon Foundation, enriching the lives of those on the Eastern Shore of Maryland through the arts. Visit avalonfoundation.org for details on events, performances, and educational programming offered throughout the year. Today's episode is sponsored by JFM Enterprises, providing distinctive ready-made and custom frames and moldings to the trade since 1974. Visit jfm.net to view their catalog of designs.
Well, good. Well, we'll get started if you're ready. You've got your water. I think we're kind of good to go. Let's do it.
This is a dumb question. Is this being filmed and recorded or just recorded?
We are recording the filming to make sure that we have two solid audio tracks. But this...
We're not going to show me some of these beautiful...
No, we haven't gotten that far yet.
If you want to change back into your pajamas, you're totally fine. I'm going to go to Assateague later. I'm already in my swimsuit. So where this is...
I got to lose about 35 more pounds before that happens, Dan. So...
Good to know. Okay.
So now, just be completely laid. Imagine yourself on the Eastern Shore and as laid back as it is out here, and channel that energy versus New York energy while you talk to us.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you.
We're at the beginning. Are you getting?
This is the beginning right now.
This is the
You're
beginning.
You're going to say hi.
You're doing it.
Oh, hello. For the first time ever, I'm going to launch this podcast. Hi, my name is Jess Bellis, and I'm here with my friend
Tim Wigand.
And we just had like a mind-blowing conversation with the smartest person I've ever talked to.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a person who is just... Yeah, exactly. It's just a person who just has a world of experience in the world of art. It was a real honor to interview him. We're talking about Dan Weiss.
He's an art historian. He's the president and chief executive officer of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And he did serve as Plein Air Easton's judge one year and jurist another year. And he is just an incredibly smart guy.
Had a great life. I mean, in terms of like his artistic life, and has done some big stuff. So we were able to talk about a lot of that, a lot of the history, even about the history of how the Met got started back in 1870 in New York. It's a great, interesting story. How love changed and turned his life into a love of art and that sort of thing.
And his view about the modern plein air movement and the value of plein air paintings from a collecting standpoint that I think a lot of our artists and collectors will find interesting. And he attended Plein Air Easton for a number of years and would come to lots of concerts at the Avalon Theater and sit quietly in the balcony, and we never knew who he was for years and years and years. And when we found out, our friends at Troika let us know that Dan Weiss was a collector who bought stuff from their gallery, and then we looked up and we saw how many interactions he had already had with us. We were sort of mortified that he had behaved like an everyman for years.
I don't think
he was sitting in the balcony.
Dude, I don't think Dan is the type of guy who's into titles.
No.
I think he's just into
art.
He's into every moment of his life, making sure he's doing the best thing for him and his family, and he doesn't care about titles. I don't think he just keeps doing the thing that he loves. He found his passion, and it was business and art, and he'll tell you all about it. This is Dan Weiss. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
I feel like I was trying to think of it. There's a great art critic from the jazz and pop section of the Village Voice called Robert Christgau, and he's the dean of American art music critics. And I was thinking, we're kind of like with the dean today. We're with Dan Weiss. Jess, you can do his introduction and his credits. He is, I know Dan just on the periphery a lot less than you and Marie do.
Dan Weiss, maybe I'll let you credentialize yourself. We know him personally best as the judge and jurist of Plein Air Easton, but his accolades extend so far beyond that.
Like a dean.
He's been a dean. He's been lots of deans.
I feel justified.
Dan, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. So I'm Dan Weiss. I am a resident of Easton, Maryland, part of the time, and Manhattan the rest of the time. And currently I'm the president and CEO of the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York. By training, I am an art historian. And earlier in my life, I was a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where I taught art history. My focus area was the Middle Ages and the classical Greek and Roman worlds. But my work at the Met involves art of all kinds, including modern art. And I have always been a great fan of plein air painting, and which is one reason why I have gravitated to being involved in the work in Easton and the Plein Air Festival. I also have a business background. I have an MBA and I worked as a management consultant. So I have the opportunity in the job I have now to do all of those things, which makes it one of the great jobs, at least for me.
That's wonderful.
Dan, where are you from? Where were you born? Talk to me about those early formative years. And do you come from an art-loving family? Do you have did you gravitate toward art and history right out of the gate? Tell me about your childhood a little bit.
Sure. So I was raised on Long Island, New York, a suburb of Manhattan, and in a kind of normal American suburb. My family was not artistic. My parents divorced when I was very young. I was about 3 years old, and my biological father was an amateur painter. So when I was a child and I would visit him, he had paintings on the wall that he had done, which I actually liked very much. So my first exposure to art was through my father's paintings. He worked in an impressionist style. He liked to do city scenes and water scenes. And in fact, in our house in Easton, Maryland, we have some of his paintings on the wall that remind me of that time in my life and of his work.
Did he paint in plein air?
Yes, he did.
He did.
He liked to paint in plein air, and he actually was a pretty good watercolorist as well. But he didn't pursue this hobby very long. There was a period in his life when I was a young child, and he was single, and he painted. And then he settled down again and remarried, and he stopped painting. But I have those pictures, and my first exposure to art was through his own work, and I've always valued that. But I did not think of myself as particularly open to art otherwise. And then when I was in high school, I took a class, again on Long Island, and we had a field trip. The class was on the humanities. It was about the world of art and culture. And we took a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was, I think, a junior in high school at the time. And that was my first visit to the museum. And I was intrigued by its magnificence, its breadth, the amount of art. The whole thing was so intimidating, but also inspiring. It stuck with me.
Had you been to museums before, or was that really your first big art museum exposure? Because Long Island isn't that far from Manhattan. It's not and there are other art museums. That was the first big time?
That's the first art museum I ever remember visiting.
Interesting.
And if I had ever visited one before, it didn't register with me and I didn't remember it. But this one I remembered, and there was something about the size and scale of the place and its general quality that really stuck with me. And I carried that visit with me for a long time. And then when I went off to college, I still didn't even know what art history was. But I was, and at the time, I think I was a sophomore in college, and I was interested in getting to know a young woman who told me she was taking a class in art history. So I thought I would take the class with her as a way of spending time with her. And anyway, what could art
This is
history
getting good.
So it worked out well. The class changed my life. The professor was remarkable, and I was exposed to a world of ideas that I had never encountered before, and I became completely absorbed in learning more about art through this class and this professor. And the girl that I was sitting next to eventually agreed to date me. That took a while. And then we've been married now for 42 years. So
living the dream life.
I was going to say, I don't know how you top that story, really.
Yeah. Starts from Long Island.
Well, he does get to top it because at the end, he's running the Met. So, the story arc is fantastic.
Well, it worked out well in every way. And Sandra and I have been together a long time. She continues to love art, as do I. And we have shared this passion our whole lives. But it wouldn't have started in the first place if she hadn't signed up for that class and I hadn't decided to track her down.
Totally like
Where was she
serendipitous
from?
moments.
Where is she from? Were you at Johns Hopkins when this was going on?
No, we actually went to college at George Washington University.
Okay, gotcha.
G-dub.
Yep.
I just love it.
Good. You got another question?
I know, I'm still kind of like taking in how
I'm thinking
incredible
of like
that
thousands of questions that are involved in those first 19 years.
Well, the subtext to this is that, and I've certainly seen this in other people, that you never know how your life is going to be shaped or what moments turn out to be really significant. For me, wandering into that class was a mindless gesture just because I didn't know what else I was doing and I wanted to get to know her. Mm-hmm. But because the professor was so compelling and I was apparently open to it, it shaped everything about my professional life that was to follow. And that professor is still one of my dearest friends all these years later.
I love it.
And I love this man and we're very close.
I know that you ended up going on and doing some teaching yourself a fair amount. Do you think that was connected to sort of his mentorship?
Or is that just the way you have to go through the art world to sort of move up?
No, it's very interesting. He would be embarrassed if he's listening to this, and eventually maybe he will. But he was he had just joined the faculty at GW. He was a young professor. He was super charismatic, really, really smart, and very passionate. And I remember sitting in the classroom watching this guy in the front of the room. He was utterly articulate. His sentences were perfect. His paragraphs were perfect. He had this passion about what he was doing. And I remember thinking quite clearly, I want to be like him. And if he had been teaching English literature, we'd be having a different conversation right now. And I really think it was because of the inspiration of his example and the way he integrated his own personal qualities with his own interests that seemed to me to be a fulfilling life. Like anybody who loves what they do as much as he does and is as good at it as he is, seems to me be the right way to go.
Right, they've got the keys.
And so I started more classes with him to learn more about the subject, and I fell in love with the subject, and he of course became a mentor for me for the rest of my life.
I love it.
You never know.
But then you went on to do some teaching yourself. Do you feel like you met the mark?
Yes, I did teach. So after I studied with him, I then went on to graduate school at Johns Hopkins, where I got a PhD in art history. And in fact, in the same subject he taught. He was a medievalist, and I too am a medievalist. And then I got hired at Johns Hopkins to stay there and become a professor. And I loved that job. I loved teaching, and I was very good at it. And I was modeling him. Yeah. I was in front of the room teaching in the way that he was teaching. And it was, I've had a lot of good jobs in my career, but that has been in many ways the most fulfilling and the most enjoyable is university teaching to students who are interested in what you have to say.
I love that.
Great.
Dan, when you were taking the PhD classes to get in this art history, I guess that is the degree. Is that was the degree?
Yeah, and the PhD.
PhD. What's the final essay like in when you go to get your PhD for anybody who might be thinking of a career? I'm just curious myself, but I think it's kind of like if there's an 18-year-old listening to this, what is the final exam when you take your PhD?
It's a long journey. So the PhD is several steps. The first step is you take classes, just like college classes, only they're harder. And you take them for a couple of years, like about 2 years worth of classes, only in art history and in subjects related to what you're doing. Then you have to take what's called a comprehensive exam. And imagine the exam was, I think, 6 hours a day for 2 days, where you have to answer questions, very complex questions about the discipline, about the field.
Can I ask what a complex question is? That's kind of where I was going with this. It's like, in other words, if you're taking your PhD in math, it says E = question mark, and there's a big math board that's filled out. What are the type of questions that you answer? That's kind of what.
So in my field, which was again in the Middle Ages, if you think about the great Gothic age in Europe, for example, you might get a question like the following: that the great cathedrals of 13th century France began with a movement in the Romanesque style. trace the development of Gothic architecture in northern France from 1200 to 1300 and take 90 minutes to write your answer.
Right.
So that something like that, and you would be called upon to bring all this knowledge that you've accumulated over the years in a very long essay. So you would do that for 2 days. You'd have a series of questions like that, big open questions where you're supposed to add a lot of what you know. Then after your exams, then you have to write what's called a dissertation. And that's a long, long essay. And basically a dissertation is a book. My dissertation was about 250 pages long. It's a book, and actually published as a book.
How long do you have to do that?
It can take years and years. I set the record. I wrote my whole dissertation in about 8 months.
Is that right?
And I think I wrote the fastest dissertation at Johns Hopkins in the humanities.
Oh, that's great.
But it can take 3, 4, 5 years. It depends on what you're writing about and how lucky you are with the material and whether you have to travel. If you have to go study in libraries or archives around the world, it takes longer. But I was able to do it fairly quickly.
So Dan, we're at sort of the place in your career where you are a professor and you're feeling very fulfilled by that. You've sort of met your first goal of finding something that you really love and being able to share it. You're emulating your mentor. What happens next?
Well, I because I had along the way in my journey, after I finished college, I worked in business a bit. I worked at the Kennedy Center in Washington, running the gift shops for a little while before I decided to go back to school in art history. And then I actually got an MBA. I went to Yale and got an MBA and worked for a few years in New York as a consultant.
And what was the drive behind getting that MBA? Did you was it intellectual curiosity? Did you feel like you needed a broader skill set? What made you want to seek that passion, or was that more about just trying to get more fundamental skills?
Did your wife go to Yale?
No, she was, by that time, she had finished her law degree at GW, so she had a real job. She was actually functioning in the world. Like somebody had to pay the bills.
And she was like, Dan, you really need more school? Is that really what you need to go do?
That question did come up. It's interesting. When I was taking those undergraduate classes with that mentor I was telling you about, I was incredibly impressed by him, but I honestly wasn't sure I had the skills or the capacity to have a life like that. To be a professor, you have to have a certain kind of academic skill. And to be truthful, I wasn't a great student at the time. That wasn't my thing. I was chasing my girlfriend into the class. I wasn't a particularly distinguished student.
Right.
But I got better at school because I was falling in love with the subject. So at the same time, I had this great job at the Kennedy Center running these gift shops. And they were actually losing money. It was a real business problem. And I was able to turn the business around and make it successful. And I thought, hey, maybe I have a flair for business. So I decided to learn more about business before I committed to a career in art history, which, by the way, I had spoken to my mother, and she said, what would you possibly do with a career in art history? That's crazy.
Right.
So I didn't go away from art history because of her, but lots of people thought a career in the humanities like that is a very big commitment with the risk of very little reward. So Don't do it unless you're really sure you want to do it. So I got the MBA, and I ended up getting a job after that in Manhattan as a management consultant, where I learned a lot more about business. And it was a great experience. But I realized by the time I was finished I had done that for 4 years, and I was good at it. But I realized I still had this art history thing in my head. And I realized, I don't know if I have what it takes to be an art historian, but if I don't try, I'll never know. So I decided to leave my career as a business person and go get a PhD, understanding that I might fail, that it may be beyond me to be successful at this, but I would rather fail having tried than never having given it a shot. And when I went back to graduate school, that's what was in my mind.
Were there times when you were pursuing that PhD where you thought, I have made the wrong move? Or once you were back in that academic space, did it just feed you and then you sort of knew it was right?
It happened fairly quickly that I knew it was right for a couple of reasons. One, because I had waited a few years and I didn't go right after college to get the PhD, because I had already gotten an MBA. And I knew how to, by that time, I did know how to be a good student.
Right, to study,
I had good study skills. And I was a little bit older. And when I went back to get the PhD, I gave up a very lucrative career. I was making a lot of money in New York. I was very successful. So the bar was high, and I was committed to doing the job the best I could, to being a student, because why am I here? It's the only reason I was doing this is because I had a passion for it. So when I went to get the PhD at Hopkins, I was much better prepared, and I threw myself into it really fully and found that I was successful very quickly. I was a good student. I actually mastered the materials, and in a fairly short order, I realized I had made the right choice, and I felt like I was, for the first time in a long time, doing what meant the most to me. And therefore, if you're connecting your own ambition to something you're actually good at anyway, and you're happy, then you're going to be better at it. And so I did the PhD very quickly. I was able to get the whole degree done in just a few years. And then I got hired there. So the whole thing played out like a dream because I had waited and I was so sure I was going to, of what I was committing to, but I knew it was a risk when I started. However, I got very, very lucky and it played out very quickly.
How much sleep are you getting during this time?
I don't know that I was getting a ton of sleep, but actually being a PhD student wasn't harder than being a management consultant.
Yeah, I bet.
The difference was I was doing something I loved.
Right.
So I didn't mind it. I worked hard, but it felt like a gift to me every day because I was thinking about what I wanted to think about. I was studying what I wanted to study, and I had been away from it for a while. So it felt like such a gift. And
but I mean, you were in the city doing all this work.
No, he was at Baltimore.
I was at Johns Hopkins. I was in Baltimore at the time. And so I was in the library most of the time, actually.
I bet.
That's kind of where the action is when you're a PhD student.
I'm just trying to balance that life of leaving the business world. And so you still had to, make money somehow. I mean, unless your wife was really doing that, you had to be extremely, extremely just sticking to it at all times. It feels like.
I had saved up when I was a business person so that when I went back to school, but also when you're getting a PhD, most of the time when you're getting a PhD at a research university, they provide financial support.
Yeah.
Because so I had grant money to cover I lived poorly. I didn't have a lot of money, but I could afford food and I had a place to sleep.
Right.
And because I was, as I said, really committed to the work, I did the work very fast and I got the PhD. The whole PhD took me start to finish about 3 years.
Let's talk for a second about the integration of those administrative tasks back into your daily work life, because that has obviously continued on to the Met. Can you find joy in that as well? Or does that kind of dilute the experience for you because your passion is really the art space? Do you like to be an arts administrator?
Yes. Interestingly, the biggest challenge I faced at the beginning was I really loved art and the research and teaching, but I also was really interested in how organizations work and in management. That's why when I finished college and I had this job at the Kennedy Center and I was running these gift shops, right. I'm a 21-year-old kid, but I was running this business that was fairly complex with a lot of people. It had all kinds of organizational problems. And I really liked using the skills I had to solve problems and make the business work. So I knew that ultimately, the most satisfying career for me was going to be something that involved both. And by the time I had tenure and was a professor of art history, I had mastered, as it were, what it took to be a successful professor. The university saw these other skills in me and they said, why don't you become the department head? Because we know you're interested in that too. And from that moment until this conversation, my whole life, I've always done both. Right. And I have always felt incredibly lucky because both of those sides to me are important.
No, it is a remarkable skill set, and I can see how it would make you really attractive to other arts organizations because you have the deep understanding and appreciation of what to me is ultimately the product, the art itself, but that you have the experience and maybe some natural aptitude as it relates to business management as well.
Well, thank you. I think if you have only one or the other, it's hard to do that kind of work in the art world because very often people who are given positions of responsibility in universities, in the art world or in museums, if they don't have any administrative skill, then they don't manage very well.
Right.
And if they have only administrative skill and they don't understand what art is all about, then they're not going to make good decisions that are respectful of the creative process or what goes into what it means to create art. I've always had the opportunity to lean in on both of those, and it has helped me in my work. So I feel lucky for that because I've always done that.
I think that the organizations that you have worked for have been lucky that you've had that skill set too.
Yeah, I want to ask one more question as we head to the break. When you were teaching, and I don't know much about getting a PhD, which is why my questions were all directed that way. But I'm guessing Jess was asking about when you were teaching back at Hopkins, what were your impressions of the students coming behind you that you were teaching at that time? Or did you not have any because you were too young and just happy with your career?
No, the greatest joy for me in teaching was I taught at all levels. I taught entry-level art history, so I would teach the survey class. And everybody took it. Pre-med students, political scientists, everybody took it. And I also taught advanced level PhD students on very narrow subjects related to their research. But the greatest joy for me was frankly teaching the entry-level students because they didn't know anything about art. And I thought, if I can do for these kids what my professor did for me, I'm going to change their lives.
Right.
By inspiring them to take an interest in this material, seeing how it can enrich your lives. So I loved doing that, and I did it with great joy every year, all the years that I taught.
We'll be right back.
The 18th Annual Plein Air Easton Competition and Festival takes place July 15th through the 24th, 2022, when 58 of the top plein air artists of our time will spend 1 week in Easton, Maryland, competing for thousands of dollars in prizes. Immerse yourself in a week of art exhibits, receptions, free demos, and panel discussions. Purchase exceptional and brand new art for that blank wall. Come for the art and make your summer memories at Plein Air Easton. The full event schedule can be found online at pleinaireaston.com.
You guys are making this a lot of fun, so thank you.
You're making it very easy.
Hi, welcome back, everyone. Again, we are here with Dan Weiss, the Chief Executive Officer of the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Where we just kind of left off before the break is we were talking about how lucky Dan and the organizations that he has worked for are because he brings a business sort of acumen with a deep understanding of art history. And I know it's kind of a long story, but how did you find yourself at the Met?
Well, for the same reason I was talking about earlier, that my career has involved both a deep commitment to the arts as my work as a professor and as an art historian and all of that. And on the other hand, this administrative work that I had done. I went from Johns Hopkins, where I was a professor, and then I was the department head. I then became a dean. I was the dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins. And then I spent 10 years as a college president, where I was leading both Lafayette and then following Lafayette, Haverford College. I was called while I was at Haverford by people at the Metropolitan asking me if I was interested in being the president at the Met, because the background that I have was so unusual, and they needed somebody who had both art history as well as management experience.
Wait, but when that phone call came across your desk, did it come as a surprise?
Total surprise, yes. I received a call. It was from the search firm who was leading the search for them, and that search firm representative called me, and I knew her a little bit over the years. She's a friend. And she said, Dan, I have something to propose to you, and don't laugh. It's I don't know if you're going to be interested in this or not, but it's a pretty great opportunity. And you're the only person in America who's perfectly suited for it.
Oh my God.
That's great.
She said, are you of any interest in being president of the Met? And I said, let me think about it. Yes. Let me think about it some more. Yes. I'd known the Met all my life.
But wait, before going home and asking your wife, you already said you would like to interview?
Well, I said I'm interested, but I actually, to be more honest, I said that's very intriguing. Let me think about it. Let me go home and talk to my wife. But I knew immediately that it would be crazy not to learn more about the role. Whether it was right for me or not would be determined in the course of discussions.
What did your wife say when you came home and you sat her down? You poured her a glass of wine and you said, I got a really crazy phone call. Is that how it went?
Yeah, well, she has followed my crazy career since I chased her into the art history class when we were students.
So she's used to your hijinks.
I've had a number of jobs. So she's moved around to support me over the years, and she has a major career herself. So every time I would bring up one of these crazy ideas, it had an impact on her and her work. So she said, okay, let's slow down. Let's just understand, what is this about and why is it interesting to you? So we talked it through, and she agreed that I was very happy in my job at the time. I was president of one of the great colleges in America, but the Metropolitan is a singular institution in the world. There's no art museum like it anywhere. And it was such a remarkable opportunity. We both agreed I should learn more about it in order to determine whether it's a good fit for me. So that was not difficult. And it's always been very supportive. And she said, if it's right for you, we'll make it work. And that's important for her and for me. So I went to New York and I met with the search firm and the people, and the fit was very positive right away. I could see that what they were looking for and what I was able to bring, I thought were well aligned. I liked the people. It's always important to like the people you're going to work with. And so I saw the fit, as did they. And pretty quickly it went from a preliminary conversation to a deeper one about whether this is right for me. And then Sandra and I had the next level conversation, like, okay, what does this really mean?
Right.
Now, how are we going to live and where are we going to live and what does this mean for our family and all of that? And those were all significant challenges because we had one of our children was in high school in Philadelphia at the time. It was complicated.
Yeah.
But we made it work and I took the job.
Oh, that's, again, a wonderful story, Dan. I want to take that as a segue when you started talking about the Met and its importance. There's no museum like it in the world, and sort of throw the second half of this conversation into more of an arts sort of direction. What is the significance of the Met when you say there's nothing like it?
Yes. So the Met it's in some ways the quintessential American cultural institution. It was created by the citizens of New York City. And picture this, in 1870, New York City was a big, successful business community. It was prospering financially. It was dangerous. It had no culture. It was a crappy place to live. It wasn't like Paris or London. Mm-hmm. It was a place that was growing, but it was still very unformed. And these citizens from New York, these leaders of the city, had the idea, we're going to create an art museum like the Louvre in Paris. The Louvre in Paris was the premier art museum in the whole world. And the Met, these guys who had this nutty idea, here's the thing, they had no art. Their idea was, we're going to build one of the great art museums in the world. The only itty-bitty little problem is we don't have any art to put in it. So it was an audacious idea to create a museum on that scale. And right from the start, their idea was the Louvre. It wasn't just like any art museum. It was the Louvre. So this vision was realized remarkably by gifts from mostly the citizens of New York and from America. Every single work of art in the Met, every single one is a gift. It was given either the object itself or the money to buy it. And the museum now has its collection is indeed the rival of the Louvre or the British Museum or the Hermitage. It's every bit the art museum of any museum in the world. But what distinguishes it above all other museums are two things. One is the range of our collection. We have modern American art. We have art from the ancient Americas. We have Asian art. We have Impressionism. We have medieval art. We have everything. And the Louvre does not have quite that range. That's one. And the other is the Met has the most vibrant and active programming of any art museum on the planet. Before COVID, the year before COVID, we would do on average in a given year about 35,000 programs a year. So imagine what that's like. Yeah. Some of them are small things like special tours. We do 40 to 60 major art exhibitions a year. Most museums might do 3 or 4. We do 40 to 60. We have our website has the most comprehensive programming of films and video and scholarly material of any website of any art museum in the world. So if you add up all of the richness of what we offer through our programs, there's no museum like us. And for those two reasons, the Met is a singular institution in the world, and we serve everybody. We're not just there for New Yorkers, and we're not just there for Americans. We are a global institution where people come from all over the world, or they just tune us in on their websites, on their computers, and they see what we have to offer from all over the world.
That is an awesome story.
It's a lot.
Is that good enough answer for you, Nick?
I think you answered the question. Dan, in your years working for the Met, you've accomplished a lot. What are some of the things that you're most proud of?
Well, interestingly, coming to the Met was this great opportunity for the reasons we described. But when I got there, it turned out the Met had very significant problems.
Right.
One of them was a very significant budget problem, that the museum had been spending more money than it has. It was heading into very significant deficits. And I realized pretty quickly that the problems were much, much deeper than anybody had realized.
Right.
So I ended up going from being a happy camper arriving at this museum to being a crisis manager very fast.
Right.
And we spent several years restructuring the museum to solve budgetary problems, which were very painful to solve. We had to lay off people. We had to do a lot of difficult work. And so I spent 3 years doing that. I loved my job anyway, and we were continuing to do the art stuff, but my days were filled with those kinds of difficult challenges. And then right after we got all that sorted out, we began to learn about this virus called COVID. And we were the first museum in New York City to close. We're the first cultural organization. I made this decision more or less by myself. I realized that the museum cannot stay open and be safe. So I called a special meeting of our trustees, and they agreed. And we announced the next morning that we were going to close. And by the end of that day, after our announcement, every major cultural institution in all of Broadway and everybody had closed.
Right.
So that started with us at the Met. And then we managed, like everybody else has, including you guys, we all have, for the next several years, how do you actually maintain a cultural organization productively in the middle of a pandemic? And I would say that you guys did a brilliant job figuring out ways to offer programming to the community by taking it outside, by offering programs. You did Plein Air in a way that was incredibly innovative, by allowing for social distancing. We had to do the same things. So I spent most of my years dealing with crises of one sort or another. But what I'm most proud of is the quality of people that I work with at the Met are the best in the world at what they do. And it is so inspiring to be working with people who can solve problems and create genius, beautiful solutions to problems, and realize creative ideas, no matter what the challenges are.
Ones that we could have never dreamed up, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. Who could have ever anticipated that the Met would be closed? When we closed the museum, I thought, we might even be closed for a few weeks. We were closed for 5.5 months.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That was tough.
Right.
But it's been an incredible privilege to work with these people. They're the best.
So after all this big talk and really putting my head around the Met, it is difficult to pivot into our tiny arts competition.
This is how you do it.
Segue it for me. Segue.
You just say, Dan, tell us about Plein Air.
Dan, tell us about Plein Air.
One of the things about Easton that anyone who knows anything about the community appreciates is how vibrant the cultural life is in this town, and how so many people who are part of Easton really appreciate and value its commitment to the arts. And at the center of all of that is Plein Air. This is this art festival that once we bought a place in Easton about, 18 years ago. And we have been coming to Easton for a long time, ever since my days at Johns Hopkins, when we learned about the Eastern Shore and we used to come out all the time. We knew we wanted to make a life there. And so we would come out to Easton, and I remember wandering into town one day when the Plein Air Festival was underway, and I knew nothing about it and how exciting it was. So for me, Plein Air in Easton is an opportunity to bring together three things. It is to bring some of the best plein air artists from all over the country to see what they can create in this sort of setting, which is sort of magical. It is an opportunity for us all to see our natural environment with new eyes, to look at areas that we love and that we see all the time as we drive by them or run through them, through the eyes of an artist, is such an inspiring experience, because you get to appreciate where you live and where you visit with new eyes. And the third is to see the community come together in a way that is so positive and so exciting, that everybody who's involved in Plein Air, and it's a very large number of people, so appreciate what it means to come together in the shared love. So for me, Easton Plein Air is the gold standard of what that kind of event can be and should be for a community. And once we discovered it, we were part of it as often as we could be.
Thank you very much.
I know, right? The best endorsement we've ever received. Do you believe that there is a modern plein air movement?
Well, I'm not an expert, I suppose, on plein air per se, but I'll tell you as an art person, what I think a modern plein air movement is, and that is to understand and appreciate what plein air is about is allowing the creative process to unfold in real space, in real time, by encountering the subject of the art in the same space. That is to say, an artist is in front of something out there just creating. And it is quintessentially a modernist movement because the only way an artist can create in that circumstance is by using spontaneity and living in the environment they live in. That is to say, you're not going to go outside and create a plein air image that is somehow completely based on early examples of other artists that you might look at in a studio. You're going to be creating based on your skill and your experience in that moment. So plein air art is quintessentially contemporary because it can only be created that way. And so in that sense, I think plein air is always going to be a modern movement.
Got it. That's well said.
Yeah.
Tell me about how do paintings achieve value over time? So if you think of yourself as a plein air collector or a collector of any fine artwork, in your opinion, like how are those paintings investments or not?
It's a great question. And of course, the issue about the value of works of art is an issue everybody in the museum field and the art world talks about all the time.
Right.
Who would have guessed that a painting by Basquiat would sell for $108 million? At the time he was painting, that's not how it rolled for him. So you don't always know. Just recently, an Andy Warhol painting sold for, or silkscreen, whatever it was, sold for $175 million. These aren't real numbers. They're just crazy.
Right.
So for me, the best way to collect art is to pay attention to what you like. Learn as much as you'd like to learn. Some people who are collectors know a ton about art, and some don't. They like looking at art. If you're making investments in art without any sense of what you're looking at, then you're probably wasting your time. And you might as well let somebody just buy it for you. Go to an art advisor and just say, I want to spend some money on art, and let them buy it for you. But my advice is don't do that. That you're drawn to art for some reason that has to do with the way it speaks to you. And there are all kinds of ways to love and appreciate art. There's no such thing as the right answer or the wrong answer. And valuation of art can change with time. Sometimes it has to do with the celebrity of the artist. I believe Bob Dylan, the famous Bob Dylan, is a plein air painter. And I would imagine, I've seen images of his work, he's quite good, actually. But if the name wasn't Bob Dylan, but Bob Smith, the object might be less valuable than it is because it's signed by Bob Dylan. So there are all kinds of reasons why works of art have the valuations that they might. The best thing you can do if you're interested in plein air art is go look at it and appreciate the richness and diversity of offerings that these artists bring forward. And the ones that touch you and move you the most, learn more about why they do. Why do I really like the work of this artist or that artist? What is it about it? Is it the color, the composition, the subject? And then the more you learn, the more enlightened the collector you will be. And then let the value take care of itself over time. I've never bought a picture in my life based on the value. I only buy the things that move me because I love them, and I'm assuming that eventually they're going to be owned by my children because I don't anticipate selling them. And if my kids want to sell them, that's okay with me. But I think that plein air art is really an act of love by the artist, and it should be an act of love by the collector.
You've just brought up so many interesting points. I guess, I'm just intrigued by these gentlemen or people who wanted to, put a museum, an art museum in the midst of all the chaos of New York City back in the 1870s. It's probably just their hobby, right? There was just nothing there, and they said, we've got to have this, or was it to, I don't know if there's any way for you to know, was it an escape from the chaos of the city? They want to bring beauty into the city, that type of thing?
Yeah, no, we know a lot about that, actually. It's very interesting because a lot was written about it. These guys they were all men, they were businessmen, and they realized that our ambition is to build New York to be the rival of London and Paris as the great cities in the world. But other than business and commerce, it's a crappy place to live. There's no art, there's no music, not much. There was just beginning. So the idea was, let's create cultural infrastructure in New York City that makes it a place not only where you can get a job, but where you want to live. So the American Museum of Natural History, which is one of the great museums in New York City, is right across Central Park. It was founded the same year the Met was founded. Mm-hmm. So this was part of a larger movement to create cultural institutions that would make living in the city more enjoyable. But prior to that time, it was a mixed bag. And there were lots of people of wealth and power who lived in New York, but they didn't have access to the culture that they realized people need, especially the average person, not just the really rich. The rich people went off to Newport in the summers and they went on their ships and they would go visit Europe. But the working people of New York City who worked 6 or 7 days a week, they didn't have access to any of that. Mm-hmm. So the museum was intended to give access to those people to the art and beauty of the world in a way that would make the city nice for them too. It was a really interesting democratizing idea that culture belongs to everybody. And they talked about that in 1870. This museum will be here for everybody. So I think it was a laudable aspiration to build these museums, including the Met, to create cities that serve the public interest.
I have 2 more questions. One is, are you an artist? Can you paint or draw, or do you? Or is that not something that you feel like drawn to or the need to do?
I have absolutely zero artistic capacity. My father was a talented painter. I am not. I'm a writer. That's where I spend my creative time. But I have no interest or ability to create works of art. I love looking at them and studying them.
You just want to appreciate them, right?
Yes, but that's it.
And my second question is one that I like to ask everybody, and it's like a little bit changed because of your job. But when you find yourself with a challenge that seems too great, or you're feeling burnt out or uninspired, what advice do you have to people who find themselves in that space? What do you do when you find yourself in that space?
Well, we all do find ourselves in that space, no matter what job we have. And at the moment, because I work at the Met, what I'm able to do is I get away from my desk and I go down the elevator and I walk through the galleries. And I remind myself why I'm doing this work in the first place and why working in this museum is such a privilege. Even if I'm dealing with an ugly problem, what we're ultimately trying to do is to build a better museum in service to the world. And in every job, not everybody works at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's important to have some sense of what does give you strength, pleasure, refreshment. And in other jobs, if I didn't work in an art museum, I would go take a walk around the block. Or when I worked on a college campus, I'd walk across the campus and I would see the students and remind myself that I'm here to help them have the kind of experiences that are going to change their lives, just as I had when I was in school. So it's important to know what moves your spirit, because ultimately what touches your spirit is what makes life interesting and worthwhile. And no matter what job you have, if you know what that is, then you'll always be able to find refreshment and restoration because you know where to find it.
That's great. Thank you for that advice.
The same walls that gave Dan Weiss inspiration when he first went into the Met when he was a child at 13 or 14 years old are still giving him the same inspiration today. That's a wonderful bookend of that.
No, I appreciate that advice. We certainly appreciate all the ways that you have supported the work of the Avalon Foundation and your participation in Plein Air Easton. We hope to see you around town inside the theater and maybe at our festival this year too. Dan, thank you so much. We hope to see you soon. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good to see you guys. Thanks so much.
The Plein Air Easton Podcast is brought to you by the Avalon Foundation and was produced by Nick Richards. Our theme music was generously provided by Blue Dot Sessions, with additional episode music by Scott Gratton. Remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. You can learn more about Plein Air Easton at pleinaireaston.com.